Montana Territory, July 1883. The church bells were still ringing when Bonnie Whitlow kicked off her satin heels and ran, lace skirts flying. Veil torn by the wind, lungs burning with each breath of dry mountain air. The road out of town was nothing but dust and gravel, but she ran like her life depended on it. Because it did. She had left her father shouting on the church steps, her would-be husband frozen in shock at the altar, and half the town of Stillwater staring after her. She did not care. Bonnie had never wanted to marry Thomas Cray, a man twice her age who smelled like cigar smoke and power. Her father said it was a fine match. Bonnie said it felt like a prison sentence. The sun was high by the time she stumbled into the hills, her white gown stained with dirt and sweat, her chest heaving. She did not stop. Not until a low snort of a horse made her spin, heart leaping. A man on horseback blocked the trail ahead, a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, his tan shirt rolled at the sleeves, dark hair curled at the edges. He dismounted slow, cautious. "You all right, miss?" Bonnie backed a step, one arm wrapped around herself. "I am not your concern. You look like trouble found you," he said, voice steady. "And I do not walk past trouble I can help." She hesitated. Her lips trembled, but she forced steel into her spine. "I left my wedding. I am not going back." The man nodded once, not judgmental, just calm. "Name's Callum Merrick. You can come with me if you want. Got a cabin not far from here. No one'll bother you there." She looked him over, dust on his boots, a rope looped at his saddle, a rifle strapped across the saddle horn. He had the look of a man who meant what he said, and nothing more. "I do not know you," she said. Callum shrugged. "You will if you come along." Bonnie's breath caught. The wind tugged her veil loose, and it fell to the ground behind her. She did not look back. "All right," she said. They rode in silence. Callum offered his hand to help her up, and she climbed behind him on the horse. The warmth of his back pressed to her front, the rhythm of the trail shaking her from her thoughts. She did not speak, and he did not force her to. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had softened to gold. It sat in a clearing edged with pine, simple but clean, smoke curling from the chimney. He dismounted first, tied the reins, then turned and reached for her. She took his hand. Inside, he offered her water, biscuits left from the morning, and a place to sit. She took all three, silent, her hands trembling as she ate. "You got a name?" he asked finally. "Bonnie," she said. "Bonnie Whitlow?" He nodded as if he already knew it. "What did you run from, Bonnie?" She looked down at her lap. "A life that was never mine. My father made a deal. I was the price." Callum poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out to her. "Then you were right to run." The words cracked something inside her. She blinked fast, swallowed hard. "I do not know what comes next," she whispered. Callum leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Well, that is the good part. You get to choose." That night, she slept in his bed while he took the floor. The mattress was rough, the blanket scratchy, but it was the first time in months she had slept without fear. By morning, the dress was gone. She wore a pair of Callum's old trousers and a shirt knotted at the waist. Her hair was braided, her skin sun-warmed. She chopped wood while he fixed the roof. He taught her how to hold a rifle, how to spot mountain cats, how to move quiet through the trees. "What do you do out here?" she asked one afternoon, sitting beside him on the porch. "Mostly keep to myself. Tend cattle, ride fence, fix what breaks." "You live like this by choice?" He looked toward the hills. "I was a soldier, came back different. Folks did not know what to do with me, so I came out here. Let the quiet fix me." Bonnie watched him, the way he rubbed a knot in his shoulder, the way his eyes followed the clouds. "Has it?" "Some days," he said. "Some days more than others." She nodded. "I understand that." Weeks passed. Bonnie learned to move like the land was hers. She rode beside him when he checked the herd. She smiled quicker, laughed louder. One night, they sat by the fire, her head against his shoulder. She watched the flames flicker in his eyes. "You never ask me to leave," she said. He turned toward her. "You never act like you want to." Their hands found each other, fingers laced slow. "I do not know what this is," she said, voice low. "Well," he said, "seems to me it is something we make, not something we name." She leaned in then and kissed him. Not rushed, not wild, just steady, like the ground beneath her had finally stopped shifting. He kissed her back, hand at her waist, thumb brushing her cheek. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I did not think I would ever feel safe again," she whispered. "Then I will keep you safe," he said. "As long as you want me to." Bonnie smiled, cheeks damp with tears she did not remember crying. "I want you to," she said, "more than anything." And Callum just held her, his arms strong around her back, heart beating calm beneath her palm. Neither of them said another word. They did not need to. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass at dawn and leaving the pines rimmed with ice. Bonnie rose before light, wrapping herself in one of Callum's wool shirts and stepping barefoot onto the porch. Her breath fogged in the air, and frost crystals made the railing sparkle in the moonlight. Behind her, the fire still crackled low in the hearth, and she could hear Callum's slow, even breathing from the pallet near the stove. She didn't wake him. Instead, she stood still, letting the cold settle into her skin, watching the sky shift from indigo to pale gray. A grouse called from somewhere in the woods, and the sound of it, not the bird itself, but the solitary cry, settled into her chest. When Callum finally stepped out behind her, hours later, he said nothing at first. Just wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stood beside her, his presence quiet and sure. She leaned into him without thinking, and he didn't move away. "I've been thinking," she said. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with concern but focus. "About. I want to learn how to do more than shoot a rifle and ride a horse. I want to know how to live out here. I want to be useful." "You already are." "Not like that. I watch you fix the corral, tend the animals, find water when the creek runs low. I want to pull my weight. Not just be something you feel responsible for." Callum looked at her for a long moment. "All right, we'll start today." And they did. He showed her how to repair the fence line with wire and cedar posts, how to spot where elk had bedded down, and how to read weather from the way the wind shifted. She learned to split kindling with a single swing, to boil hides for oil, to mend leather with sinew and an awl. Some nights they sat close at the fire, their words slow and quiet, hands brushing when they passed the pot between them. Others, they worked too late to speak, collapsing into sleep with dirt under their nails and the smell of horses on their skin. One afternoon, she found a rabbit caught in a snare he'd laid near the creek. The animal was still alive, shivering, blood on its foot. She knelt beside it, unsure. Callum was chopping wood nearby. When he saw her crouched there, he came over slow, wiping his brow. "I didn't mean for it to suffer," she said, voice low. He took the rabbit from her gently, hands sure. "Sometimes out here, things die hard. But we can make it quick now." She turned her face away as he ended it. When he brought the rabbit back to camp, she followed, stomach tight. That night, she skinned it herself, hands steady, jaw set. Callum didn't say a word, just handed her the blade and stepped back. Later, as they sat eating, she asked, "Do you ever miss people?" His gaze stayed on the fire. "Sometimes. Not always the same ones, though. I used to think I needed a room full of voices to feel like I mattered. But out here, it's quieter. And I feel more like myself than I ever did in town." He looked at her then, and his voice was soft. "You're more than just yourself, Bonnie. You've got grit. You've got grace. And you don't back down." She didn't look away. "You see all that in me?" "I see it because I live beside it." That night, she didn't wait for him to settle on the floor. She took his hand and led him to the bed. There was no rush, no fumbling. Just warmth and stillness, and the way his breath deepened against her collarbone after. In the morning, they rose together. She tied her braid back with a strip of old calico and set about making oatcakes while he checked the smokehouse. Later, when they rode out to check the west pasture, Bonnie leaned forward in the saddle and asked, "What would you have done if I hadn't run into you that day?" "Rode the same trail I always do," he said. "Maybe fixed the fence. Maybe hunted along the ridge." And now, he didn't answer right away. But when he did, his voice was low and sure. "Now I ride home to someone who looks me in the eye and makes me want to be better." She turned in the saddle, watching him from the corner of her eye. "You already are." He reached out, brushing a fleck of dust from her cheek with the back of his hand. "Then that's your doing." The sun crested over the ridge just then, lighting the valley below. The grass swayed in golden waves and a pair of hawks circled high overhead. Bonnie closed her eyes for a moment, the wind cool on her face, and thought, "This is a life I chose. And I would choose it again." By September, the aspens had turned and the world outside the cabin stood in shades of gold and amber. The mornings came colder, breath visible in the air even after sunrise. Bonnie had taken to wearing Callum's old canvas coat when she rode, the sleeves too long and the collar worn smooth. She never mentioned how she liked the way it smelled faintly of pine and saddle oil. They had been hauling cutwood up from the ravines since dawn, the wagon nearly full by the time Bonnie caught her boot on a root and stumbled. She caught herself before falling, but Callum was beside her in a second, his hand steadying her elbow. "You all right?" She pushed back a strand of hair that had stuck to her cheek. "Just clumsy." "You're tired," he said. "Let's stop here. We can haul the rest tomorrow." She shook her head. "We said we'd finish today." He looked at her a moment before nodding once. "Then we finish." They worked in silence for the next hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the thud of wood on wood. When the last log was stacked, Bonnie leaned against the wheel, chest rising and falling with effort. Callum pulled a flask from his coat and offered it to her. She took a sip and winced, coughing once at the sharpness. "What is that?" "Juniper and rye. Keeps the cold off." She handed it back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I'll take your word for it." They sat on the wagon bed as the sun dipped lower, long shadows slanting across the clearing. Callum rubbed his palms together, the skin cracked at the knuckles. "I've got a sister," Bonnie said. "Younger by 3 years. Lydia. She's the only one who ever said I should leave if I had to." Callum looked over at her. "Where is she now?" "Back in Stillwater, I expect. Married to a clerk. She's small and sharp-tongued. Terrible at lying. You miss her." "Sometimes. But she never asked me to come back." "That's something." Callum nodded, quiet for a while. "Then I had a brother. Older. Died in Missouri during the war. He was the one who taught me to ride. Told me once that a man can live without much but not without purpose." Bonnie turned toward him. "Do you think you've found that?" He didn't answer right away. "I think I might be standing next to it." She didn't speak. Just reached over, took his hand in hers, and held it. Later, as they returned home, the horses moved slow, hooves muffled against the pine needles. Callum drove the wagon while Bonnie watched the tree line, eyes scanning the shadows. A lone blacktail stepped out onto the trail ahead of them, pausing just long enough to raise its head. Callum stopped the wagon. "You see that?" She nodded, breath caught. "He's not afraid." "No," she whispered. "He's not." That night, Bonnie sat at the table stitching a tear in the lining of her coat, while Callum patched a hole in the stovepipe. The lamp between them cast their shadows long against the walls. "When the snow comes," she said, not looking up, "does it get hard to get supplies?" He glanced over. "A bit, but I've got enough salted meat and flour to last. We'll trap through the worst of it." She nodded, tying off her thread. "Then I'll learn to trap." "You don't have to do everything, Bonnie." "I want to." Callum set down his tools. "You don't have to prove anything to me." She met his gaze. "I'm not proving. I'm choosing." His expression softened then, something unspoken passing between them. He stood, crossed the room, and held out his arms. She rose without a word and stepped into them, her head settling beneath his chin. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the wind brushing the shutters. When she pulled back, she looked up at him. "Could you ever see yourself married again?" His brow furrowed slightly. You asking? I'm wondering, she said. If it's something that still matters to you. He brushed her hair back, his fingers light. It didn't. Not for a long time. But I think if it were you, if you wanted it, I'd say yes without blinking. Her voice was quiet. I'd want it because of you. Not because I was told to. He nodded. Then we'll do it in spring. Just us. No one else to say what it should be. She smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. That sounds right. Later, as they lay beneath the quilt, her leg tangled with his, she whispered, I didn't know love could feel like this. Like something you grow into, not something that takes you over. Callum traced a line along her shoulder. It's the only kind that lasts. She drifted off with her hand on his chest, the steady beat beneath her fingers as sure as the earth beneath the cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the porch. But inside, there was only warmth, and the deep, quiet knowing that neither of them would ever have to run again. The first snow came softly in the night. By morning, the hills were white and still, the trees heavy with it, the sky a pale, washed blue. Bonnie stood in the doorway with her arms locked around herself, watching the flakes drift down like sootless ash. The world looked hushed, like it was listening. Callum came up behind her, pulling on his gloves. Creak'll freeze soon. We'll have to break it open each morning. She nodded, eyes tracking the slow descent of a hawk above the ridge. I've never seen a winter like this. It gets quiet out here. Real quiet. You all right with that? I think I need it, she said. They saddled the horses and rode out to scatter feed for the cattle. The snow was only ankle deep, but already crusted thick. Bonnie's mare, Cricket, moved steady through it, her breath steaming in the cold. Callum pointed out the breaks in the fence where elk had pushed through overnight, and they worked to shore it up with pine branches and wire. When they rode back, Bonnie's fingers were stiff around the reins. Inside, Callum built the fire higher, and she peeled off her gloves, laying them over the stove to dry. She didn't speak until the room had warmed again. I dreamed of my mother last night, she said. Callum sat across from her, one arm resting on the table. He didn't press. He never did. She used to keep a trunk by her bed, Bonnie went on, full of things she never wore, ribbons, old letters, pieces of lace. When I was small, I thought it was treasure. Now I think it was just the only thing she still had that hadn't been chosen for her. Callum rubbed his jaw, the firelight catching the scar under his chin. Did she want to leave? She wouldn't say. She just got quiet after a while. Like the wanting had worn thin. Callum leaned forward. You think that's what'll happen to you? I did, she said. But not anymore. He reached across the table, his hand folding over hers. You've got more in you than quiet. She turned her hand under his and held on. That afternoon, they loaded the sled and rode out to the highwoods to cut balsam fir. Callum had marked the trees weeks ago, and Bonnie followed him as he moved between them, his axe swinging slow and even. She gathered the limbs he lopped off, tying them in bundles to dry for kindling. They worked past dusk, the snow deepening with each hour. On the ride back, shadows stretched long across the trail, and the wind picked up sharp from the north. You ever think of leaving here? Bonnie asked, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Callum didn't answer right away. Not since you arrived. At the cabin, she helped him unhitch the horses, rubbing Cricket's neck while Callum tossed down hay. Inside, the smell of smoke and pine filled the room. She took off her boots while he stirred stew on the stove. You ever miss being around other people? She asked. He ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to her. Sometimes. But I've never liked being stared at. Out here, no one's watching. I used to think being seen was the same as being known. He sat beside her. It's not. No, she said softly. It's not. They ate in silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the quiet clink of spoons. When the bowl was empty, she set it aside and rose to stoke the fire. Callum watched her a moment, then said, I've been thinking of building a second room. For storage. Or whatever else we might need. She looked back over her shoulder. We? His eyes held hers. It's your home too. Bonnie crossed to him, resting her hands on the back of his chair. Then build it. I'll help. He reached up, catching her wrist gently. You've changed this place. You changed me first. I didn't mean to. I'm glad you did. That night, they lay in bed with the window cracked open, the scent of snow drifting in with the cold. Bonnie watched the moonlight trace lines on the ceiling. I don't want to go back, she said. Callum turned toward her, his hand resting on the curve of her hip beneath the quilt. You're not going to, she smiled in the dark. Then I think I'm finally home. His voice was a whisper. You've been home since the day you came down the trail. Bonnie closed her eyes, her breath slow and steady. Outside, the wind settled. Inside, everything held. By early December, the snow had settled thick along the ridgelines, and the world had shrunk to the space between the cabin and the edge of the trees. The sky stayed a pale pewter most days, heavy with clouds that never quite broke. Bonnie had learned to tell time by the way the light moved across the floorboards and the cadence of Callum's footsteps outside. She stood by the table, working a length of wool into a proper scarf. Her fingers had grown sure with the needle, though she still pricked herself now and then. Callum was beside the hearth, fitting a new hinge to the trapdoor that led to the cellar. His coat hung on the peg, damp at the hem where the snow had soaked through. Do you ever think about what kind of man you would have been if the war hadn't come through? Bonnie asked, not looking up. Callum straightened slowly, eyes on the hinge. Maybe a different one, maybe not. He rubbed the back of his neck. My father was a cattleman. Thought I'd follow him. I used to think the war pulled me off a straight path. Now I'm not sure there ever was one. Bonnie set the scarf down, brushing stray fibers from her lap. I used to think I'd marry into a house with tall windows and silver on the table. But I can't picture it now. It wouldn't feel like breathing. Callum stood and crossed the room, wiping his hands on a cloth. Funny how the things we thought we wanted fall away when we're finally allowed to want something else. She met his gaze. And this? What we've built. I want it more than I ever wanted a name in town, he said. More than I thought I could. A quiet settled between them, but it wasn't empty. Bonnie moved to the window, watching the wind rattle the bare limbs of the cottonwoods. I found an old ledger in the cabinet, she said. Pages torn, but there were names. Looks like someone lived here before. A man and his wife, Eliza and Nathan. They wrote about planting barley, about losing a child, then starting over. Callum stepped beside her. You think they left? I think they stayed as long as they could. He rested a hand on her lower back. And us. We're staying. That night, the wind came howling down the slope, bending the trees and shaking loose snow from the roof. Callum stayed near the stove, stirring a pot of beans and salt pork. Bonnie leaned against the counter, her palms warm from the drying dishes. I had a thought, she said, voice low. Callum turned, ladle in hand. I'd like to marry you before the thaw. He didn't blink. You sure? I am. He set the ladle down, crossed the room in 2 strides, and cupped her face with both hands. I've never been more certain of anything than this. She leaned into him, her breath catching when their lips met, slow and steady, the kind of kiss that said they'd already lived through the fire and come out whole. They didn't speak again that night. There was no need. They found a preacher over in the valley near the Gallatin, a man who traveled on snowshoes from homestead to homestead when weather allowed. He came 3 weeks later, wrapped in a bearskin coat and smelling of pine pitch. Bonnie had sewn herself a new dress from brown calico, nothing grand, but she'd edged the sleeves with lace she'd found tucked in the bottom of the cedar chest. They stood before the hearth, hands clasped, while the preacher read from a worn book. Callum's voice didn't waver when he said, I do, and Bonnie's smile broke wide when she echoed it back. After the preacher left, Bonnie poured cider into 2 mugs and handed one to Callum. I didn't know I'd be happy like this, she said. You earned it, he said. With every step you took away from that church. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the fire snap and the snow tick softly against the windows. They built the 2nd room in spring, just as the trees budded and the creek ran high. It wasn't large, just enough for a work table and a tall shelf where Bonnie kept her sewing and the few books they'd traded for. Callum framed the window to face the east so the morning sun would catch her hands as she stitched. By summer, they had a small garden. Bonnie planted beans, onions, and beets in the dark soil while Callum fenced the edge to keep the deer out. He built her a bench beneath the spruce, and she often sat there in the evenings watching the light shift across the hills while he whittled on the porch. They never spoke of town again. One afternoon, Bonnie found a letter tucked inside the folds of an old shawl in the trunk. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Lydia's. Dated just a few weeks after Bonnie had run. I hope you found something that feels like living. I hope you know I never blamed you. If you see mountains, breathe them in for me. Bonnie read it aloud to Callum, her voice steady. Then she folded it again, pressed it flat, and tucked it into the cover of their ledger beside the pages where she'd started adding her own notes, dates of the first frost, when the calf was born, the morning they married. Callum took her hand. You want to write her? She nodded once. I think I do. They sent the letter with a passing trader, and by the time the leaves turned again, a reply came. Lydia wrote of her daughter, of the shop her husband had opened, and of her hope to visit when the child was older. Bonnie smiled as she read each line, then put the letter away and turned back to the stove where Callum was stirring stew. Company's coming, she said. He looked up. We'll be ready. Years passed. The cabin grew weathered at the edges, but the rooms stayed warm. Bonnie added to the garden each spring, and Callum taught her how to shape the orchard trees. They built a small barn, then a lean-to for the tools, and in time, a second horse joined the first in the pasture. They aged slowly, without rush or worry. Some evenings, they sat on the porch in silence, hands clasped, watching the sky darken over the ridgelines. Other nights, they danced slow across the wooden floor. No music but the wind and the creak of the rafters. They never left, and they never had to. What they had was not loud or showy or spoken in grand declarations. It was in the steady way they moved beside each other, in the way Bonnie rested her hand on Callum's back when he bent to tie his boot, in the way Callum always poured her coffee first. It was in the life they built, quiet, honest, and wholly chosen, and they lived it together until the end of their days.